Good evening. It's good to have this room filled for the second of our 4 presidential lectures on Abraham Lincoln. When we were preparing the presidential lecture series this year, there was really only one name on my list of possible speakers I considered a must-get. Anybody who works in my field of U.S. history knows that for the past 11 years, Michael Burlingame had been at work on a truly monumental biography of our 16th president, and had branched out far beyond the usual circle of sources. You see, people like me get to know all too well the pithy quotations by Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, the clever diary entries by his young secretary, John Hay, the speculations about his first love, Anne Rutledge, from the same sources. The quotations from the same New York newspapers. Perhaps because of his background in psychohistory, and as he told us just now in the room before the program, that's actually one word. And while there are psychohistorians, he is a psychohistorian. That, if you don't know, is the study of the psychological motivations for historical events and the search for the emotional origins of behavior of people, groups, and nations. Michael Burlingame approached the daunting task of writing a biography of Lincoln differently than most. He redoubled efforts, begun in his 1994 study, The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln, to get at the psychology of his truly fascinating subject, while uncovering more fresh sources than any Lincoln biographer at work in my lifetime. And he thought, reflected, and even started over when he discovered new evidence that didn't support his initial arguments. He's truly a historian's historian. This Lincoln bicentennial season will bring us almost 100 book-length titles, many of which, to be honest, won't be very good. A few, however, stand out and will stand the test of time. Just one glance at Lincoln, a Life suggests that this one was built for the ages, like Sandburg or Donald. This certainly isn't one of the recent slice books that have dominated the literature lately. Ones that talk about Lincoln's last day, Lincoln's best speech, what Lincoln would have had on his iPod. Okay, that last one isn't a real book, but it was a subject of an NPR Morning Edition story yesterday. And I think we can all agree that Lincoln would have hated ABBA. I have no idea, actually. But back to Lincoln, a Life. It's extremely thorough, and I don't just mean it's more than 2,000 pages in 2 volumes. It will teach you new things about Abraham Lincoln and new ways to think about him and his times. It is beautifully written, and it is extremely ambitious. Burlingame is a researcher's researcher as well as being a historian's historian. For example, he uncovers in this book some of Lincoln's early and anonymous opinion pieces. At least he makes a very good argument that they're written by Lincoln. And he reads in numerous newspapers and magazines not published in New York City. In addition to the new biography and The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln, Burlingame has published 10 other books about Lincoln and his times, often encompassing previously unpublished primary sources. A graduate of Princeton and the Johns Hopkins University, Professor Burlingame is the May Buckley Sadowski 19 Professor Emeritus of History at Connecticut College, and perhaps the holder of the longest title in academia. He has been teaching at Connecticut College since 1968, and he is currently, some of you may be happy to know, at work on a 1-volume abridgment of Abraham Lincoln, a Life, a brief book on Lincoln and the Civil War, and several compilations of Lincoln primary source materials. It is my pleasure to welcome to the stage and to the Dole Institute, Michael Burlingame.
Well, thank you, Professor Earle, for that very generous and kind introduction. And it's a great honor for me to be here, and I thank the Dole Institute for inviting me. I'm always glad to speak in any state that has the good taste to name a town Burlingame. Actually, that was named after my great-grandfather's cousin, who was a Massachusetts anti-slavery congressman, and who achieved a certain celebrity in 1856 when Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner was beaten into insensibility on the floor of the Senate by a South Carolina congressman because Senator Sumner had delivered a speech called The Crime Against Kansas, in which he chronicled the abuses that were heaped upon the free soil settlers of this state by the Missouri border ruffians and other pro-slavery elements. And my ancestor achieved certain celebrity by denouncing this South Carolina congressman in the House of Representatives. And the South Carolina congressman then challenged my ancestor to a duel, which put my ancestor at some disadvantage because he wasn't familiar with duels and firearms, and the South Carolinians were. So he faced a dilemma. Either he turned down the challenge, in which case he would be known as a coward, or he accepted it, in which case he would probably be known as a corpse. So I figured out a middle way between the Scylla and Charybdis of those two options. And so he said, all right, Congressman, we will fight a duel, but since dueling is illegal in this country, we will go to the nearest soil where it is legal. So I'll meet you on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls. Now, that was very clever of Uncle Anson, because in order to get to Niagara Falls, he would have had to go through western New York, which was heavily abolitionized. And Congressman Brooks of South Carolina would have been lynched if he set foot in western New York. So Uncle Anson got away by saving his face and his life. I thought I might start by telling you a little bit about how I became a Lincoln Scholar to begin with. Partly it's because of Uncle Anson. Lincoln appointed him as ambassador to China. So there's a very tangential link between me and Lincoln through that relationship. It's also because I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. That was just slightly after the unfortunate event at Ford's Theater. I don't mean to joke about my age. I'm 67, but I prefer to think of it as 19 Celsius. Feel free to use that. Another reason that I became a Lincoln Scholar is that I had the good fortune as a freshman in college to take a Civil War course with David Herbert Donald, who was a mesmerizing teacher as well as a splendid scholar. And he took me under his wing and made me his research assistant, and profoundly affected my life. If he had been a medieval historian, I might well be writing about the Middle Ages today. And finally, I think I became a Lincoln Scholar because of an episode that occurred in the summer between my junior and senior years at Princeton. That summer, I had a job at the Library of Congress, at the Manuscript Division, and that job had been obtained for me through the good offices of the chairman of the History Department at Princeton, who was also at the Library of Congress that summer, working on a magisterial history of European economic development. And he would swing by the Manuscript Division regularly at lunchtime and invite me to join him for lunch, along with several eminent scholars. Is everything all right? With several eminent scholars of European and American history. That was a very heady experience for a callow youth of 20, as I then was. And one day, about a dozen of us were sitting around the Library of Congress cafeteria, and one fellow began talking about Douglas Southall Freeman. Now, as many of you probably know, Freeman wrote a 4-volume biography of Robert E. Lee, a 3-volume study of Lee's lieutenants, and at the end of his life, he was writing a multi-volume biography of George Washington. And this fellow said, there's a funny thing about Freeman. You could detect changes in him as each volume appeared. He began to adopt Washington's gestures and mannerisms. Then he began to adopt Washington's locutions, so been speaking in 18th century expressions. And by the end, he even began to look like George Washington. Well, I straightened up my bow tie and I said, well, after I graduate, I'm going on into a PhD program in the Civil War and Reconstruction, and people tell me that I look like Abraham Lincoln. At which point the chairman bangs his fist on the table, and all the knives, forks, and spoons go leaping into the air and come clattering back down to the green formica-clad tabletop. And every head in the Library of Congress cafeteria turns around to see what the racket's all about. And he announces in a voice that could have been heard in Baltimore if the door had been open. He said, "Holy mackerel, Mike, you're ugly, but you're not that ugly." And ever since then, I think I was fated to be a Lincoln Scholar. And being a Lincoln Scholar has many advantages. For one thing, Lincoln was extremely humorous. You can't do research about Abraham Lincoln without running into funny stories that either he told or were told about him. And one day I was doing research in the New York Public Library in the main reading room, which was packed as usual. And I was going through some reminiscences of Lincoln by people who had known him. And I ran into a funny story about a half hour into my work. And without bothering to think where I was, I burst out laughing. I probably shouldn't be telling the story in a library, but anyway, I burst out laughing, and everybody around me went, "Shh, shh, shh." And I said, "Excuse me, forgive me." So I continued my work. Another half hour or so, and another funny story appeared, and I burst out laughing once again. And this time people more emphatically went, shh, shh, shh. Excuse me. Finally, it happened a third time. And the woman sitting across from me, who was a woman of roughly my vintage, very earnestly taking notes from a sociology tome, woman with no makeup, wire-rimmed glasses, hair in a bun. And she leaned across the table, and she fixed me with her gaze, and she said, "Just good as your field, anyhow. I think I'm going to switch to it." Reminiscent of a scene in When Harry Met Sally. I'll have what she's having. Right? Okay, enough levity. Let's get down to business here. The new information that I was able to find about Abraham Lincoln inspired me to do this big new book, Abraham Lincoln, A Life. Be sure to buy it. You don't have to read it, but be sure to buy it, okay? The new information, people ask me, how in the world could there be any new factual information about Abraham Lincoln, about whom so many books have been written? And the answer is, if you look in unpublished sources, in manuscripts, manuscript collections around the country, you will find letters, speeches, diaries, in which Lincoln is quoted, he's mentioned, he's described, his policies are analyzed. But it requires traveling around the country. It requires sifting through handwritten documents, oftentimes very hard to read. And it's easy to find Lincoln's own letters, they're published, and speeches, they're published. And it's easy to find the letters that Lincoln received, because they're at the Library of Congress in the Lincoln Papers. What's hard to find is speeches, letters, diary entries about Lincoln. People would visit Lincoln in the White House, then they would write home to their wives or their political associates or their business associates, and they would say, "I spoke to the president today, and this is what he told me." But to find letters like that, you really got to sift through an awful lot of material. And I've done a lot of that. And I'd like to share with you some of the findings I made, particularly in the Frederick Douglass papers at the Library of Congress. In those papers, I found two speeches that I thought were extremely revealing. And one of them was delivered on June 1st, 1865. This was 6 weeks after Lincoln was killed. And in this speech, Frederick Douglass said, Abraham Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president. Emphatically the black man's president. And that phrase leapt off the page because almost everybody who writes about Lincoln and race quotes a speech that Frederick Douglass gave in 1876 in which he said, Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president. I thought, well, this is startling. I had never seen an allusion to the speech in which the opposite is maintained, namely that Abraham Lincoln is emphatically the black man's president. So I immediately went to the 5-volume edition of Frederick Douglass's speeches that had been published by the Yale University Press. And the speech wasn't there. And I was quite startled. So I wrote to Yale, to the people who edited these 5 volumes, and I asked, why have you omitted this remarkable speech? And I received no response. So I called them. They never called back. Well, those of us who went to Princeton aren't surprised Yale would conduct itself this way, but that's a whole other story. And I kept reading the speech after this startling description of Lincoln as emphatically the black man's president. Douglass goes on to say, Abraham Lincoln was the first American president to rise above the prejudices of his time and his country. He was the first man to honor black people as men and citizens. By inviting me to the White House, that is Frederick Douglass, Lincoln was saying, I am the president of the black people as well as the white people, and I mean to honor them as citizens and as men. So this, I thought, was a truly, thank you, memorable. Okay, excuse me. I didn't know where the water was stationed. So then I discovered another speech in the Frederick Douglass papers, and lo and behold, it's a powerful speech, and it's also not in that 5-volume edition of Douglass's speeches. And it was delivered in December of 1865, and in it, Frederick Douglass alludes to Lincoln's last public speech, which of course Lincoln didn't know was going to be his last public speech. Frederick Douglass said that when Lincoln delivered those remarks on April 11th, 1865, 2 days after Robert E. Lee surrendered. He called publicly for black voting rights. And we, that is, abolitionists like myself, were a little unimpressed with that because it was so limited in scope. The president said that he believed black people should be allowed to vote, at least those who had served in the Union Army and those who were very intelligent, by which we assume he meant literate. And Lincoln said, or Douglas said, that was a little disappointing to us, but we should have recognized that that was an extremely important speech, because Abraham Lincoln learned his statesmanship in the school of rail splitting. And to split a rail, you take a wedge, and you insert the thin edge of the wedge into the log. And once you've done that, you take a hammer, you take a maul, and you drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And we should have known on April 11th that when Lincoln called for limited black suffrage, that was the thin edge of the wedge. And once he had inserted the thin edge of the wedge, you could count on him to drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And it's a brilliant image, and I think it's quite true. And he said, in the conclusion of this speech, he said, for every American, the death of Abraham Lincoln is a tragedy. But for black people, it is an unspeakable calamity. And there was, however, in that audience on April 11th, 1865, one member who did understand the full significance of Lincoln's call for limited black suffrage. And that was a young, charismatic, popular actor named John Wilkes Booth. And he, upon hearing Lincoln endorse publicly limited black suffrage, turned to his companions and said, that means nigger citizenship. That's the last speech he's ever going to give. I'm going to run him through. And 3 days later, Abraham Lincoln was murdered by Booth because he had endorsed black voting rights. Thus, we should think of Abraham Lincoln not as somebody who was killed because he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, not because he endorsed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery everywhere in the country, but he was killed because he called for black citizenship rights. And therefore, I think it's appropriate for us to regard Lincoln as a martyr to black citizenship rights as much as Martin Luther King, or Medgar Evers, or Viola Liuzzo, or James Reeb, or Michael Schwerner, or Andrew Goodman, or James Chaney, or any of the other civil rights activists who were murdered in the 1960s. So this manuscript collection yielded these insights, which I found significant. Another source of manuscripts that I looked at was in Indiana. There were a lot of reminiscences of the Lincoln family in Indiana. They lived there from the time young Abe was 7 until he was 21. And in these reminiscences, there are many, many references to Lincoln's father. And there has been a tendency in recent scholarship to try to portray Lincoln's father as a respectable member of the frontier bourgeoisie. He wasn't. The traditional picture of Lincoln's father as a somewhat lazy, shiftless ne'er-do-well is accurate. And this relationship between Lincoln and his father, this nature of Lincoln's father, I think is extremely important in understanding why Lincoln hated and loathed and despised slavery. You will hear it sometimes said that Abraham Lincoln was a reluctant emancipator. That's simply not true. Lincoln, from early on, hated and despised slavery. And he says, in the 1850s, he says, I have always hated slavery. I have hated slavery as much as any abolitionist. In 1864, he writes in a famous public letter, he says, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. The evidence for Lincoln's early hatred of slavery is strong. Not only his statements in the 1850s and 1860s, but when Abraham Lincoln was a young man in his 20s, serving in the Illinois state legislature, he took a bold step. Southern legislatures asked northern legislatures to condemn the abolitionist movement. And the Illinois House of Representatives obliged. It voted by the lopsided margin of 77-6 to condemn abolitionism. 6 members of that body had the nerve to obviously buck the current. Of those 6, Abraham Lincoln was one. In addition, of those 6, 2 went even further and issued a public statement saying slavery is based on injustice and bad policy. Now, in 1837, in Illinois, in central Illinois, that took a lot of nerve. Abolitionism was not popular. The anti-slavery movement was having great trouble getting going in Illinois. And of those 2, and of whom Lincoln was one, only one was running for re-election, and that was Abraham Lincoln. Then, when Abraham Lincoln served in Congress, as was pointed out in this clever ad, Lincoln served 1 term in the U.S. Congress in his late 30s. And as a congressman, he framed a bill to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. This was far more radical than what the party was favoring. They were talking about eliminating slave trading in the District of Columbia. But Lincoln goes farther and says slavery itself should be abolished. Now, I wondered why it was that Abraham Lincoln would have hated and loathed and despised slavery early on, and why he would stick his neck out so prominently as he had done. Now, if he had been born and raised in New England, that wouldn't be surprising. He may have imbibed anti-slavery views from the atmosphere. But he was born and raised in Kentucky for his first 7 years, and then he lived in southwestern Indiana, which is transplanted Kentucky. Now, Kentuckians moved into Indiana in large numbers. They couldn't bring their slaves with them, but they could bring their pro-slavery attitudes. So Lincoln, from the age of 7 to 21, was not living in a region in which anti-slavery views were popular. Then Lincoln marries into a Kentucky family, prominent slaveholding family, so he's not imbibing anti-slavery views from his in-laws. And he was running for office in central Illinois, which was also filled with Kentuckians. And they were not enthusiastic supporters of the anti-slavery cause. So I wondered, what is it that predisposed Lincoln to hate and loathe and despise slavery? Well, I thought about that question, and then to answer it, I reflected upon the nature of Lincoln's anti-slavery utterances. And there was a striking feature to Lincoln's speeches and letters dealing with slavery, and that is that he doesn't emphasize the traditional arguments that most anti-slavery speakers used. For example, he doesn't talk about the physical cruelty of slavery, the beatings and the whippings and the like. That was a very popular argument, very effective argument used by abolitionists. Lincoln doesn't touch it. Lincoln doesn't talk about the breakup of slave families and how outrageous it is that children are sold away from parents and husbands are sold away from wives. That, too, was a very popular argument, as Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin showed. He doesn't talk about the creation of a quasi-aristocratic social order in the Old South based on slavery and how undemocratic that is. He doesn't talk about the suppression of free speech and freedom of the press and freedom of assembly that was common in the South and in parts of the North. Instead, he intones one argument over and over and over again, namely that it's an outrage that slaveholders have rewritten the word of God Almighty himself, who, upon expelling Adam from the Garden of Eden, said, "In the sweat of thy brow shalt thou eat bread." Now, says Lincoln, it is truly outrageous that the slaveholders have rewritten the word of God Almighty to read, "In the sweat of somebody else's brow shalt thou eat bread." That it's an outrage that somebody works in the hot sun all day and somebody else derives all the profits. Now, Lincoln wasn't the only man to make this argument, but I thought it was noteworthy that he emphasized that to the virtual exclusion of every other argument against slavery. So I thought about that. Why would he do that? And then I reflected upon his relationship with his father. Abraham Lincoln and his father were estranged. One of the most dramatic documents in the Lincoln canon, the one that shocks a lot of people when they first become aware of Lincoln's writings, is a letter he writes when his father lets it be known that he's dying and would like to see his son Abraham. His father was living in a town called Goose Nest Prairie. That's not a figment of Garrison Keillor's imagination. There really is a town called Goose Nest Prairie, about 60 miles from Springfield. And Lincoln's father couldn't write to him because he was illiterate. But Lincoln's stepbrother writes and says, "Our father's dying and he would like to see you now." Lincoln writes back and says, "Tell our father that it would probably be more painful than pleasant if we were to see each other now." And that document, I think, speaks volumes. Because no matter how estranged a child may be from a parent and a parent from a child, the imminence of death usually acts as a solvent on that estrangement, but not in Lincoln's case. So Lincoln does not visit his father on his deathbed. He does not mark his father's grave with a stone, and he was the only one in the family with money who had enough money to do that, and he didn't do it. He does not name a child after his father, and to allow his father to know that his name is going to be carried on. Lincoln's father was named Thomas. And so the first child that the Lincolns have is named Robert Todd Lincoln after Mary's father, Robert Smith Todd. So you might think the second child, also a boy, would be named after Lincoln's father, but no, it's named after Edward Baker, a good friend and political ally of Lincoln's. So then a third child comes along, also a boy, and you might think, well, now Thomas Lincoln will be honored by having his name carried on. And no, it's named after his wife's half-sister's husband. And then Thomas Lincoln dies, and then only then, after the death of his father, does Lincoln name a boy Thomas. But he calls him Tad, because I think he really didn't like the name Thomas, but he felt obliged, perhaps out of filial duty, to do so. So in any event, there's a deep estrangement between Lincoln and his father. Now, what accounts for that? Well, it's hard to say for sure, but I think one of the reasons is this. Lincoln was eager for education, and his father discouraged him in that endeavor. His father wanted him to work and not to spend time reading. And his father would pull him out of school on more than one occasion in order to make him go work for neighbors in order to earn money. In fact, because he was pulled out of school so often, Lincoln's total sum of formal education was less than 12 months. That is a sobering statistic for those of us in the ed business. So, Lincoln then was pulled out of school, he would go to work for neighbors, and he would perform backbreaking farm chores. He would dig up stumps. He would kill snakes. He would chop down trees. He would build fence rails. Hard, backbreaking work. And he might get 25 cents for a full day's work. And he would take that home and he would turn it over to his father. That was the law of the land. You were the property of your father until you became 21. Now, it may seem quaint for us in the 21st century to regard children as an economic asset. Let me repeat that. It may seem quaint for those of us in the 21st century to regard children as an economic asset, but that was in the days before orthodontia and high-priced liberal arts colleges like Connecticut College, where I taught for 30-some years. Anyhow, so here's Lincoln. Lincoln goes out and he works in the hot sun all day, and somebody else gets all the profits. So I speculate that Lincoln hated and loathed and despised slavery early on because he unconsciously identified himself with the slaves and his father with the slaveholders. Now, it's hard to prove this hypothesis, and my traditional historian friends, who are all from Missouri, that is, they say, show me. And that's one of the great advantages of historical training. What's your evidence? How can you prove this? And so they'll say, do you have some hard evidence for this? What they really want is a diary entry where Lincoln sits down and says, "Dear diary, today I realized that my father treated me like a slave, and so I decided to come out against slavery because I unconsciously identify myself with the slaves and him with the slaveholders." Well, you're not going to get evidence like that. Unconscious motivation by its very nature does not admit of such evidence. But there are some pieces of evidence. Lincoln, for example, in a long letter, describes a broken romance that he had. A woman from Kentucky comes to Illinois. Lincoln courts her. Then they get engaged, and he has buyer's remorse, or potential buyer's remorse. And so he breaks the engagement, and the marriage doesn't occur. And Lincoln says, in recounting the history of this engagement, he says, apropos of being engaged to this woman, "There is no form of bondage, real or imaginary, that I have ever been in from which I more longed to escape." It's a nice sentiment for Valentine's Day, don't you think, right? It's nice. So what's Lincoln saying there? He says, I know what it's like to be in bondage. I know what it's like to be a slave. Now, I don't think people use, I obviously didn't mean it literally, but I don't think people use metaphors and images randomly. I think when you're talking about important emotional issues and you use a figure of speech, it oftentimes can reveal what's going on below the surface of the rational conscious ego. And then in 1856, Lincoln, according to one reminiscence, gives a speech in which he says, you know, the problem with slavery, among other things, is that it doesn't allow people to rise. Now, my friend out there, John E. Roll, he used to be a slave and he's now a successful merchant. And I used to be a slave, but I'm now so free, I'm a lawyer. But black people can't do that. And I thought that phrase, I used to be a slave, was pretty startling. So I tell my traditional historian friends that these are, to be sure, pieces of evidence which aren't overwhelmingly conclusive, but they're highly suggestive. And they say, yeah, but they're not conclusive. And I say, all right, what's your explanation then? Well, why do you think Lincoln hated and loathed and despised slavery? And they have a hard time answering. One answer that has been offered, which has some merit, is that some children are born with really sensitive consciences. And there's no psychological explanation. They're just born with that. And other children are born without super sensitive consciences. Take, for example, my children. I've been a vegetarian for, 40 years. And I was told, when I spoke in Topeka last fall, and I was told at dinner by a resident of that city that the word vegetarian is actually an ancient Kaw Indian term. I said, oh, really? He said, yeah, he says, it's an ancient Kaw Indian term which means very poor hunter. I said, oh, okay, well, live and learn, live and learn. So I've been a vegetarian for a long time. And when my children were little, they would say, well, Daddy, we know it bothers you, but it doesn't bother us. So I'd say, okay, you little barbarians, what killed animal do you want for dinner tonight? At the same time, I had a colleague in the history department at Connecticut College whose child, upon reaching the age of 3 and understanding where lamb chops and hamburgers came from, said, no more for me, thanks. And his father wasn't a vegetarian. His mother wasn't a vegetarian. He just happened to have a sensitive conscience. So he was more like Lincoln, and my children were like the rest of us. So a psychological explanation can't explain everything. But I think that Lincoln's decision to emphasize that argument about slavery and its evils being that somebody works in the hot sun all day and somebody else derives all the profits was so resonant with him because of his own personal experience. Another source of new information about Lincoln comes in newspapers. Newspapers are a grossly underutilized source by historians, or at least of Lincoln historians. As was mentioned by Professor Earle, an awful lot of scholars who write about Lincoln and the Civil War and do newspaper research confine their research to New York newspapers. And that's not entirely irrational, because the New York newspapers had the biggest staffs and the biggest budgets and therefore the most comprehensive coverage of Washington events. But imagine, if you will, that you're a Kansas senator or a Kansas congressman or a Kansas general, and you go into the White House and you speak with the president, and you come back out. Who do you speak to? What journalist do you approach? Somebody from the New York Herald or the New York Times or the New York Tribune? No. You go to somebody who is a journalist in your own state. You tell them what's going on. So you have, in order to really get a comprehensive view of Lincoln during the Civil War, you have to read newspapers all around the country. And I've done a lot of that work. It's rather tedious. Just have to sit in front of a microfilm reader and turn the crank and look at the Washington correspondence day after day after day. But if you do that, I find that every 8 hours or so that I put in doing that, I find a statement either directly quoted or indirectly quoted from Lincoln, which is tantamount, not quite as good as, but it's tantamount to a new statement by Lincoln. And I intend to edit a volume called What Lincoln Said According to Contemporary Civil War Newspapers. But even more interesting was the Springfield Whig newspaper. Lincoln was a Whig and not a Democrat, which a lot of people find very surprising. Lincoln was born into real poverty. Don't let people persuade you that Lincoln lived a kind of middle-class life on the frontier. Most people on the frontier were poor, but the Lincolns were really poor. So Lincoln's born into poverty. So why doesn't he support the Jacksonians, the party of the common man? Why would he support the Whigs, who have traditionally been portrayed as the party of aristocracy and privilege and elitism? And I think the answer to that is that, first of all, that's something of a caricature of what the parties were really like. And second, Lincoln wanted to liberate people from rural isolation. He grew up in rural isolation in Kentucky and Indiana. And rural isolation featured ignorance, backwardness, drunkenness, and he wanted to liberate people from that. And the only way to do that is to get people into a market economy. As long as people are subsistence farmers living on the frontier, they will be living in backwardness, ignorance, and poverty. How do you get people out of rural isolation? You have roads, railroads, canals. You allow them to get their goods to market. You also allow them to have banks, and banks where they can make loans and establish their own businesses. You also provide tariffs to protect them from unfair foreign competition. So Lincoln's support of the Whig Party, I think, was designed to help liberate people from rural isolation and backwardness that he himself had observed. Anyway, so Lincoln writes for this Whig newspaper, and we know this from his law partner. His law partner said Lincoln wrote hundreds of pieces for the local paper, and nobody has tried to identify those pieces. Well, I took a stab at it, and I've identified over 200 that I'm pretty sure are by Lincoln. And I'm sorry to say, these are not the Gettysburg Address. These are not the second inaugural. These pieces are low-road politics, which assault with sarcasm and ridicule Democrats. And so Lincoln really was a low-road politician in his 20s and his 30s. He was something of a political hack. The only exception to that general rule is his statement about slavery, that it's based on injustice and bad policy, and then his bill abolishing slavery in the district. But for the rest of it, Lincoln's 20s and his 30s are pretty uninspiring. Then Lincoln takes a 5-year vacation from politics. At the age of 40, he drops out of politics. He no longer runs for office. He'd been running for office ever since he was 23. Every opportunity, he would seek political office. From 40 to 45, he sits on the political sidelines. He dabbles a little bit, but not much. At 45, he comes racing back into politics as a high-minded, high-road politician, a principled, highly articulate advocate of the anti-slavery cause. And no more ridicule of Democrats, no more sarcasm, hard, brilliant, powerful, eloquent arguments against slavery. And it's something of a mystery. How is it that the young man who was a political hack in his 20s and his 30s becomes the statesman in his 40s and 50s? Well, it seemed to me clear that in those years between the age of 40 and the age of 45, Lincoln went through tremendous psychological growth. And this is a period in many men's lives of the early 40s where a great deal of introspection takes place. It's a midlife crisis. The midlife crisis has been rather caricatured as a period in which men run off with their secretaries in red sports cars. Well, that sometimes happens. But the midlife crisis is a very important period in many men's lives. When you ask questions such as, have I made the right choice of career? Have I made the right marital choice? What do I want to do with the rest of my life? I'm not going to live forever. What kind of legacy do I want to leave? What's really important to me? Have I neglected aspects of my character and personality that need to be nurtured? There are a number of questions like that that get dealt with in the early 40s. And out of that period of introspection and out of that crucible of reflection can come tremendous psychological growth. Doesn't always happen. Some people crash and burn in that period. Some people don't change much at all. But occasionally, people can undergo a great deal of growth. And it seems to me that that's what Lincoln did. That in that period, and it's very hard to know what was going on in his mind because the correspondence we have of that period is mostly business. He doesn't keep a diary. He doesn't write intimate letters to friends in which he talks about his inner life. We do know what he looked like when he went into his 40s, and we do know what he looked like when he came out at 45. And we can infer from that, I think, that this tremendous period of psychological growth took place. And that was the secret of Lincoln's success. It has been argued by one of the most distinguished historians of the Civil War era that Lincoln's leadership is the crucial variable that allowed the North to prevail in the Civil War. James McPherson, the leading historian of the Civil War period, has made that argument and endorsed it. And it was most dramatically made by a gentleman named David Potter. And he said that if a man like Abraham Lincoln had been president of the South, and a man like Jefferson Davis had been president of the North, the South probably would have won. And one of the ways in which Lincoln and Jefferson Davis differed is that Jefferson Davis quarreled with almost everybody. He quarreled with his vice president. He quarreled with his Congress. He quarreled with his generals. He quarreled with the newspaper editors. Because he was extremely touchy and egotistical, as many people in politics are, present company excluded, of course. And he said, David Potter said, Lincoln was the opposite, and that's true. And I would like to close my formal remarks by quoting from my favorite Lincoln document. This is a statement that was given to a young Union officer in 1863. Lincoln was very busy, but he took time out to offer some paternal advice to this young Union captain. And he said to him, apropos of the captain's tendency to quarrel with his superior officers, he said to him, quoting from Shakespeare, Lincoln was a great fan of Shakespeare's, quotes from Hamlet, one of his favorite plays. And he says, quoting Polonius' speech to Laertes, which you may recall is the one that goes, neither a borrower nor a lender be, to thine own self be true, and so forth. Well, Lincoln says to this young captain, the advice of a father to a son, beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it that the opposed may beware of thee, is good, Lincoln said. That's good advice, but not the best. Quarrel not at all. No man determined to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Still less can he afford to take all the consequences, including the vitiating of his temper and the loss of self-control. Yield greater things to which you can show no more than an equal claim, and lesser things, though clearly your own. Better to give your path to a dog than be bitten by him in contesting for the right. Even killing the dog would not cure the bite. I thank you for your attention. I would be happy to try to answer questions or respond to comments, and we have students with microphones who will, if you raise your hand, you'll get a microphone and you can ask the question so we can all hear it.
There was a recent documentary on public television that I thought was very disturbing. The African-American moderator tried to lead people into believing that Lincoln did not want to free the slaves. And one of the African-Americans that was interviewed said he should not be on Mount Rushmore. And it was a very negative commentary on Lincoln. And I wondered what you thought of that and if you happened to see it.
I missed that. I've been a little busy lately. But I've heard about it. And that argument is not unfamiliar to me. There's perhaps the worst book on Lincoln ever written was called Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream, by a journalist named Lerone Bennett, making the argument that Lincoln was a hopeless racist and honky and the like. And I remember when I first got that book, I read the first chapter and I said, this is terrible. I'm not going to bother to read the rest of it, because he grossly misunderstands the context in which Lincoln worked and Lincoln's later growth. But then somebody asked me to review it, so I felt, all right, I have to read the whole book. And so I did, and then I wrote a review, and I called it Forced into Reading, Forced into Glory. The argument goes something like this, that in 1858, when Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas were conducting their famous debates, Lincoln, in the fifth debate, began by stating that he didn't believe that black people should be allowed to vote or to hold office or serve on juries or intermarry with whites. And this is then lifted out of context and used as the definitive statement of Lincoln's views on race. And it was used by segregationist senators in the early 20th century, Theodore Bilbo and people like that, James K. Vardaman. But you have to understand the context in which that statement was made. The debates between Lincoln and Douglas in 1858 were largely over the question, is slavery right or is slavery wrong? And Lincoln said very explicitly, let's not talk about black citizenship rights. Nobody really, no white people anyway, seriously are arguing now that black people should be allowed to vote or hold office or to intermarry with whites and serve on juries. That's a false issue. That muddies the waters. It's a red herring. Let's get that out of the way. And this was the Democrats' major argument. They were playing the race card. They were racial demagogues. And so Lincoln was trying to respond to that by saying, that's not an issue before us now. The question is slavery right or wrong? We Republicans believe that slavery is wrong. It's a moral, social, economic, and political wrong. And slavery should not, therefore, be allowed to expand. The Democrats believe that slavery is not wrong and therefore should be allowed to expand. And let's keep our eye on the main issue. And, of course, Lincoln's views don't get frozen in time in 1858. As I said earlier, in April 11th, 1865, he publicly calls for black voting rights and gets murdered for calling for it. And one of the main reasons why Lincoln's views change over time is because of the contributions of black soldiers to the Union war effort. About 180,000 blacks served in the Union Armed Forces. That's about 9% of the Union Armed Forces, even though black people were only 1% of the northern population. And Lincoln said, and many other Northerners said too, if black people are willing to sacrifice, to serve in the army, to run the risk of getting killed, to suffer all that you suffer in warfare, they deserve citizenship rights. And he had said this actually privately a year before he gave that speech on April 11th. He had written to the governor of Louisiana, the government that was about to reconstruct Louisiana, and he said, you folks down there are about to adopt a new constitution, and I suggest for your private consideration, would you please incorporate black suffrage? And Lincoln, that was the thin edge of the wedge. And then Lincoln publicly calls for that on April 11th. And so this notion that Lincoln is a racist, that he must not be honored on Mount Rushmore, I think is based on a gross misunderstanding of Lincoln's racial views and how they evolved.
All right. I'm in a Civil War history class, and we just had to write a term paper. And one of the questions we had was, do you think Lincoln cared more about abolishing slavery or preserving the Union? And I just wanted to see what you had to say about that.
The question, well, Lincoln regarded the Civil War as achieving three different things: preserving the Union, abolishing slavery, but most important, vindicating democracy. His secretary, his assistant secretary, John Hay, comes into his office about a month after the war begins and says, Mr. President, we're getting deluged with mail from people urging you to emancipate the slaves. And Lincoln says, I regard this war as a war to prove that popular government is not an absurdity. Lincoln quite reasonably understood that the United States was an experiment. It gave common ordinary people a voice in their governance. And conservatives around the world were looking to the United States, and liberals too, to see whether that experiment would work. And if the war were lost, it would go far to discredit the idea of democracy. That people could say, conservatives throughout the world could say, well, democracy looks good on paper, it sounds good in theory, but in practice it doesn't work. Look, the United States tried it and the country fell apart. So democracy would be discredited as an idea. And so I think that was the most important consideration in Lincoln's mind. And preserving the Union was, of course, essential in order to vindicate democracy. And Lincoln de-emphasized the slavery issue in the first year and a half of his administration, not because he was indifferent to the slavery issue. Au contraire, if Lincoln had had his own way, if he had acted solely on his own personal feelings, he would have issued the Emancipation Proclamation the day he was inaugurated. Because, as I said earlier, he hated and loathed and despised slavery. But he had also taken an oath of office to uphold the Constitution, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. The Constitution does not authorize the President to issue an Emancipation Proclamation in peacetime. Also, there were political considerations. If Lincoln were to succeed in keeping the Union intact, he would have to win the war. In order to win the war, you had to keep the border slave states loyal. That is Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Those 4 slave states stayed in the Union. If Lincoln acted precipitously to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, he was legitimately fearful that he would drive the border slave states into the arms of the Confederacy. And he issues an Emancipation Proclamation, or he announces that he's going to issue one. And by the way, that's on my tie. I commend this tie to your attention. That the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, he waited until September of 1862, when the war is well underway, before issuing it or announcing that he was going to issue it, because he wanted to keep Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland in the Union, particularly Kentucky. Lincoln once was asked, do you think we can win the war if God's not on our side? He said, well, I don't know about that, but I know we can't win it if Kentucky isn't on our side. I think it's impossible to say that Lincoln valued Union or abolition more one than the other. But I think what we can say is vindicating democracy was the central goal of the war as he understood it.
If you use a formal definition of abolition, or that notion of being an abolitionist, how close did Lincoln get to that at the end of his life?
Well, the term abolitionist there are many varieties of abolitionists. There are Simon pure abolitionists who believe that slavery should be abolished instantly with no compensation. It just has to be done right away. There are political abolitionists who say slavery has to be abolished, but it has to be done through the political process, through laws and amendments and the like. And Lincoln supported gradual emancipation with compensation to owners. And then he recommended colonization. That is to say, once black people were liberated, they would be encouraged, not forced, but encouraged to settle outside the United States. Now, there's a lot of criticism of Lincoln for being a colonizationist, and I think that criticism is somewhat misguided, because what Lincoln knew was that when he issued an Emancipation Proclamation, there would be tremendous white backlash, particularly in the lower North. An awful lot of white people in the North said, we will fight to preserve the Union, but we will not fight to liberate the slaves. And Lincoln needed those people to support the war effort. Now, emancipation was dreaded in part because it would mean that black people would be aspiring to equal status and equal citizenship rights and for jobs. And to minimize that white backlash, Abraham Lincoln supported colonization. And he was told by many people in the North, our constituents, senators and congressmen told him, our constituents will not back emancipation unless it is coupled with colonization. Because a lot of people believe that slavery is wrong, but they don't want to have to live next door to black people. And if you offer colonization as part of the package, then that will sugarcoat the pill for our constituents. And so Lincoln did offer this, but he insisted that it not be compulsory. Some of his cabinet members wanted colonization to be mandatory, and when Lincoln recommended it, it was voluntary. And he dropped that soon after black people started serving in the Army. That argument disappears from his public speeches and his proclamations. So Lincoln was an abolitionist, a political abolitionist, but not a Simon Pure abolitionist.
Lincoln is reported to have suffered from depression. How do you think, if indeed he did suffer from depression, what's your opinion of that, and how would that have influenced his conduct of the war and his decision making?
Lincoln did suffer from depression. That's true. In my book, The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln, I try to explore that in one of the 9 chapters. And on 2 occasions, when he was in his 20s, Lincoln was so depressed that his friends feared that he would commit suicide. And they removed all sharp objects from his reach, lest he do himself in. These 2 bouts of what we would call today clinical depression didn't last very long, about 3 weeks in each case. But they were quite remarkable. And later on, in his 30s and 40s and into his 50s, he was predisposed to depression, but he wasn't debilitated by it. And the reason why he was, I think, predisposed to depression is because of a series of deaths that he observed when he was young. His mother dies when he's 9 years old under very painful circumstances. And it's a poignant picture to try to imagine Lincoln in a one-room cabin with his mother laid out, suffering from milk sickness, dying, taking over a week to die, thrashing about, her tongue turning black. And imagine a little 9-year-old boy watching this day in and day out as his mother dies. Then his baby brother dies in infancy. His older sister dies in childbirth in her late teens. So both of his siblings die. His mother dies. And then his father is an unsympathetic soul, as I suggested earlier. And modern clinical studies have suggested that people who lose a parent early, oftentimes as adults, will suffer from depression. That is, unless the surviving parent is nurturant and emotionally available and nurturant and supportive. And Thomas Lincoln was not that way. So a lot of damage was done to Lincoln in that period right after his mother's death. Now, he has a very fine stepmother. His stepmother comes along 15 months later, and she helps undo a lot of the damage that was done. She was a remarkable woman. But there was still pretty significant damage done. Then there were other deaths that occurred later. His sweetheart dies when he's in his 20s, Anne Rutledge. He suffers a loss when he's experiences career failures. He runs for the legislature and gets defeated. He runs for Congress and gets defeated. He runs for the Senate twice and gets defeated. He tries to get the commissioner of the General Land Officeship. That he gets defeated. And those were like little deaths, too, and that tended to send him into depression. And so in my book, I try to examine the origin of Lincoln's depression. There's been a fine book published since then called Lincoln's Melancholy by a very fine historian named Joshua Wolf Schenck. And he concentrates on the effect of Lincoln's depression. And he suggests that because he suffered from depression, Lincoln was more empathetic to people who were suffering in general, more sensitive to their needs, to their suffering, and became a more humanitarian and a more empathetic human being. And I think there's a good argument to be made for that. But I think one of the striking things about Abraham Lincoln that I admire is that he was able to overcome that. That Lincoln was an extraordinarily psychologically mature and balanced human being, despite the fact that his mother dies when he's 9, despite the fact that he has an unsympathetic father, despite the fact that he has a painful midlife crisis, despite the fact that he has an unusually unhappy marriage, despite the fact that he has several career failures, despite the fact that 2 of his children die before they reach adulthood. And despite all that, he was able to overcome that and to become Abraham Lincoln. Not just famous and not just powerful, but remarkably psychologically whole and balanced. And what I find remarkable about that is and so admirable, is that he can serve as an example for the rest of us. That you can be born into emotional poverty, you can suffer from emotional shortchange, and you can still overcome that and become a psychologically balanced and whole and mature human being.
We've been told that Abraham Lincoln was not interested in being a member of a church, or not particularly interested in going to church, but I read the other day that when he was a young man, he studied the Bible a great deal and even memorized portions of the Bible. How do you feel that his Bible studying reading might have affected the psychological Lincoln?
Well, that's a good question. Lincoln did not belong to a Christian church. That is to say, he said that I would gladly join a church that didn't have an elaborate creed. But if you're going to be a Methodist or a Baptist or a Presbyterian or the like, Episcopalian, you have to agree to an awful lot of provisions of a creed, and he said that he found it hard intellectually to accept all those provisions. He said that if he ever found a church whose creed consisted of the 2 great commandments, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, and all thy soul, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, that church he would gladly join. Lincoln did read the Bible a great deal. One of the reasons he was such a good writer is that he was intimately familiar with the King James Bible and with Shakespeare. Those were the books he read over and over and over again. And he knew the Bible. He knew great passages of the Bible by heart. And he would astound his friends by his ability to cite biblical passages without having to look them up. And As a young man, Lincoln was a skeptic. That is, he was raised in pretty crude frontier conditions. And it's been said by a knowledgeable authority that until he was in his 20s, Abraham Lincoln probably never heard a preacher who believed that the earth was round. So frontier preachers were oftentimes ignorant, drunken, ill-lettered, and ill-mannered. So Lincoln becomes a skeptic in his 20s and his 30s. In fact, he writes a tract, a kind of skeptic's tract, and his friends fear it's going to ruin his political career, so they grab it from his hands and throw it into the fire. After his midlife crisis, after his period from 40 to 45, Lincoln's views on religion change. And he becomes much more respectful of the power of the Almighty. And he has a vision of the Almighty as a force who intervenes in history, who cares about justice. And one of the most dramatic ways in which Lincoln's religious views affect his public policy and his statements is the second inaugural address. The second inaugural, which is usually regarded as his greatest speech, is famous, of course, for its final paragraph, with malice toward none, with charity for all. But the most remarkable passage in that document is not that final paragraph, but an earlier paragraph, in which he addresses the question of why there has been so much bloodshed in the war. Now, Lincoln had written a memo to himself. Lincoln, in order to help clarify his thinking, sometimes would just sit down and write out his thoughts. And that helped clarify his thinking. And I've told my students, you think that when you write a paper, you do your research and your thinking, and then you write it up. But actually, writing is thinking. Those are not mutually exclusive categories. So Lincoln writes a little memo to himself at some point in the war when things are going poorly. And we don't know exactly when that was. But he says, in effect, I don't understand why the Almighty allowed this war to begin. He could have stopped it before it started. I don't understand why the Almighty allows the war to go on and on and on. More and more people get killed. More and more widows and orphans are created. It is incomprehensible to me why the Almighty doesn't stop this war and stop this terrible bloodshed. He says it more eloquently than that, but that's a paraphrase. He answers that question in the second inaugural address. And he starts by quoting a passage from the Gospel according to St. Matthew, where Jesus says, Woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come. But woe unto that man by whom the offense cometh. And then he goes on to say, and I paraphrase, if we shall suppose that slavery, American slavery, is one of the features of life that God has now willed to remove, and it's an offense. And if we shall suppose that he gives to white people this terrible civil war as the woe unto those by whom the offense came, then that may answer the question of why the war has been so bloody. He said, it may well be that this war will not end until the scales are balanced, until all of the blood shed by slaves over 250 years shall be compensated for by white blood drawn by the sword. Black blood drawn by the lash, white blood drawn by the sword. And if we shall suppose that God will not stop the war until $1's worth of property, of white property, is destroyed for every $1's worth of labor that has been stolen from the slaves. And only until that blood and that property damage is even, until the scales are even, that the 250 years of unrequited toil that blacks have had is then met by the blood and treasure of white folks. Then and only then the war will end. He says, we can't be sure that that's the case. But what we can say is that if it is the case, we have to agree with the psalmist of 3,000 years ago, the ways of the Lord are righteous and just altogether. It's a remarkable speech. And whenever I go to Washington, which I do frequently, I visit the Lincoln Memorial. And as you probably know, when you go into the Lincoln Memorial and you're standing in front of the statue of Lincoln enthroned, if you look to the right, you'll see the full text of the second inaugural address. And one of the most touching scenes that I find touching is to see parents with their little children reading the second inaugural to their children. and teaching them to regard this as one of the sacred documents of American history. And it's not an exercise in triumphalism. It isn't a pat on the back. It's saying this is a war that has been inflicted upon us by the Almighty because we have mistreated black people. And I think it speaks very well for Lincoln, and it speaks very well for our country that we regard the second inaugural in that light. Are we over?
Yeah, I hope you'll join me in thanking Professor Burlingame for a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your attention.